Now, Donald Trump's pick to be America's top diplomat is Marco Rubio. His confirmation hearing began a short while ago today. Let's listen in to a little of what is happening there live right now.
The job I've been nominated for without the love and the support of our families. I'm also very pleased that my sisters, Barbara and Veronica, and my nephew Orlando, are joining me here today. And to me, it's a reminder that the path that brings me to this moment was paved by those who are not here with us today, by two parents who arrived here on May 27th of 1956 from Cuba, and they had nothing but the dreams of a better life. And because of them, I had the privilege to be born a citizen of the greatest nation in the history of mankind and to be raised in a safe and stable home by parents who made their children's future the very purpose of their lives. I also want to acknowledge all the blessings that God has bestowed upon me in my life. My faith is critical and something I will lean and rely on heavily in the months that are ahead. In a tumultuous world where, in my faith, we are called to promote the cause of peace and the common good. And that task has gotten harder than it's ever been. And I will rely heavily on my faith and pray for God's blessings, that He will provide me the strength, the wisdom, and the courage to do what is right in these tenuous moments. At the end of the Second World War, the United States was, in the words of then Secretary of State, tasked with creating an order, a world order, a free half, as he quote in his quote, out of chaos, without blowing to pieces, without blowing the whole of the world into pieces in the process. And in the decades that followed, that global order served us quite well. Americans' incomes rose and communities flourished. Alliances emerged in the Indo-Pacific and Europe that led to the emergence of stability and democracy and prosperity in these regions.
You've had forever war ever since. Little Marco, keep your hands.
Back to order.
All right, alliances emerged in the Indo-Pacific and in Europe that led to the emergence of stability, democracy, and prosperity, but it also prevented a cataclysmic world war. And ultimately, a wall in Berlin came down, and with it, an evil empire. Out of the triumphalism of the end of the long Cold War emerged a bipartisan consensus. And this consensus was that we had reached the end of history, that all of the nations of the world would now become members of the democratic Western-led community, that a foreign policy that served the national interest could now be replaced by one that served the liberal world order, and that all mankind was now destined to abandon national sovereignty and national identity and would instead become one human family and citizens of the world. This wasn't just a fantasy. We now know it was a dangerous delusion. Here in America and in many of the advanced economies across the world, an almost religious commitment to free and unfettered trade at the expense of our national economy shrunk the middle class, left the working class in crisis, collapsed our industrial capacity, and has pushed critical supply chains into the hands of adversaries and of rivals. An irrational zeal for maximum freedom of movement of people has resulted in a historic mass migration crisis here in America, but also around the world. It's one that threatens the stability of societies and of governments. Across the West, governments now censor and even prosecute domestic political opponents. Meanwhile, radical jihadists openly march in the streets and sadly drive vehicles into our people. While America far too often continued to prioritize the global order above our core national interests, other nations continue to act the way countries always have.
Pause. Back to order.
I get bilingual protesters, which I think is an entry cool.
As you know, that's a first here for us, at least in recent times.
All right.
Healthcare is a human right.
All right.
Education is a human right. Sanctions against.
Back to order.
All right. So So while America too often prioritized the global order above our core national interests, other nations continued to act the way nations have always acted and always will, in what they perceive to be their best interest. And instead of folding into the post-Cold War global order, they have manipulated it to serve their interests at the expense of ours. We welcomed the Chinese Communist Party into the global order, and they took advantage of all of its benefits, and they ignored all of its obligations and responsibilities. Instead, they have repressed and lied and cheated and hacked and stolen their way into global superpower status, and they have done so at our expense and at the expense of the people of their own country. In our very own hemisphere, narco-terrorists and dictators and despots take advantage of open borders to drive mass migration, to traffic in women and children, and to flood our communities with deadly fentanyl and violent criminals. In Moscow, in Tehran, in Pyongyang, dictators, rogue states now sow chaos and instability and align with and they fund radical terror groups. And then they hide behind their veto power at the United Nations Security Council or the threats of nuclear war. The post-war global order is not just obsolete, it is now a weapon being used against us. And all this has led to a moment in which we must now confront the single greatest risk of geopolitical instability and of generational global crisis in the lifetime of anyone alive and in this room today. 8 decades later, we are once again called to create a free world out of the chaos. And this will not be easy. And it will be impossible without a strong and a confident America that engages in the world, putting our core national interests once again above all else. Just 4 years ago, I believe we began to see the outlines and the beginnings of what that would look like. During President Trump's first term, American strength was a deterrent to our adversaries, and it gave us leverage in diplomacy. There were no new wars. ISIS was eviscerated. Soleimani was dead. The historic Abraham Accords were born, and Americans were safer as a result. Now, President Trump returns to office with an unmistakable mandate from the voters. They want a strong America engaged in the world, but guided by a clear objective to promote peace abroad and security and prosperity here at home. That is the promise that President Trump was elected to keep. And if I am confirmed, keeping that promise will be the core mission of the United States Department of State. Now, tragically, horrifying atrocities and unimaginable human suffering can be found on virtually every continent. And I am certain that today I will be asked about the array of programs and the activities the Department of State carries out to address them. We are a nation who was founded on the revolutionary truth that all men are created equal, and that our rights come not from man or from government, but from God. And so we will never be indifferent to the suffering of our fellow man. But ultimately, under President Trump, the top priority of the United States Department of State will be the United States. The direction he has given for the conduct of our foreign policy is clear. Every dollar we spend, every program we fund, every policy we pursue must be justified by the answer to one of 3 questions. Does it make America safer? Does it make America stronger? Or does it make America more prosperous? Under President Trump, the dollars of hardworking American taxpayers will always be spent wisely, and our power will always be yielded prudently and towards what is best for America and Americans before anything and everything else. Prudence in the conduct of foreign policy is not an abandonment of our values. It is the common sense understanding that while we remain the wealthiest and the most powerful nation on the earth, our wealth has never been unlimited, and our power has never been infinite. And placing our core national interest above all else is not isolationism. It is the common sense realization that a foreign policy centered in our national interest is not some outdated relic. Since the emergence of the modern nation state over 2 centuries ago, countries acting based on what they perceive to be their core national interest, that has been the norm, not the exception. And for our country, placing the interest of America and Americans above all else has never been more relevant or more necessary than it is right now. For in the end, how can America promote the cause of peace on earth if it is not first safe at home? What good is America to our allies if it is not strong? And how can America help end the suffering of God's children across the world if it is not first prosperous here at home? I thank you, and I hope I can earn your support, whether it's because you believe I will do a good job or because you want to get rid of me. Thank you.
Either way, the result's the same. Thank you, Senator Rubio. I've always been impressed with your view, particularly on a 50,000-foot level, of the kind of problems that we face in our lane and national security lane, foreign relations and intelligence. So appreciate those remarks. We're now going to start a round. I'm going to allow 10-minute questions since this is a cabinet level position. That doesn't mean you have to use all 10 minutes, but the 10 minutes are there. And what I'm going to do in this hearing and what I'm going to do in future hearings is I will call on people based on seniority on the committee at the time the gavel goes down. And if you come after that, you'll be put in line after that, and we'll go down the list like that. In any event, with that, Senator Rubio, could you talk for a minute about the Russian energy reliance? I think all of us were impressed when the war started that the Europeans knew the necessity of cutting the cord with Russia on their reliance on Russian energy, which had developed since the Iron Curtain came down, all of us believing that Russia would behave itself, which turned out to be a very misplaced view. And now, with the war carrying on, it's going to end, obviously, at some point in time. There are voices in Europe saying, well, we can go back to using Russian energy. My view is that that's not reasonable and it's not appropriate. And indeed, I think that the fallout from this war is going to go on for generations. Your thoughts on the energy relationship between Europe and Russia in the future?
Well, I'm reminded, I believe back in 2018, then President Trump, on two occasions, once at the United Nations and I think another time at a NATO conference, pointed, for example, to Germany's reliance on Russian energy as a real vulnerability. And he was snickered at. I remember he was snickered at by the representatives of Germany at the United Nations. He turned out to be 100% correct. In fact, that reliance on Russian energy was a major loss of deterrence. Vladimir Putin, among his many calculations, one of the calculations he took in going in Ukraine was that the Europeans would complain, maybe they'd hit him with a couple sanctions, they'd write some strongly worded nasty letters about him, but ultimately would not be able to do anything effectively because of how much they depended on Russia. And in some cases continue to depend. I believe France is the third leading payer into Russian energy in the world, and I think a couple other countries in Europe follow right behind. So there's still a significant amount of dependence in that regard. And that dependence on Russian energy is a tremendous amount of leverage that Vladimir Putin holds on his neighbors in Europe. Now, there is some good news. I think, for example, I watched with great interest the German engineering marvel, where they've been able to, I think by the end of this year, after they waived permitting requirements, and within 9 months, we're able to open what is literally a floating LNG terminal to allow and receive exports, including from the United States and other places. So I do think you're seeing movement in Europe now to try to detangle itself from that level of dependence. But it remains a real vulnerability and a tremendous piece of leverage for Putin against his neighbors in the broader world. It's also a reminder, by the way, and I used to be guilty of saying this quite a bit, that the Russian GDP was the size of Italy's, not very large. I think one of the things we learned from this endeavor is that it's not just the size of the GDP, but what it's composed of. And the Russian GDP, while smaller than some other countries, is largely reliant on the production of raw materials, on the energy, on food production, fertilizer and the like. And these are critical components of national strength and a reminder of how important they are for us here domestically as well.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I do think, too, we ought to acknowledge that the Europeans did a job that was well beyond their.
All right, you've been listening live there to a little of Marco Rubio laying out his vision for America's role on the world stage as he seeks to become Donald Trump's Secretary of State. He said Trump's win shows that voters want, quote, a strong America. Well, listening to that with me, Ketavan Gorjestani, our foreign editor. And Ketavan, what did you get from what he had to say in terms of what his ideological vision for the United States would be should he be confirmed as Trump's top diplomat?
Well, his message was basically defending Donald Trump's vision of the world, which is that this is not about isolationism, but this is about putting America's interests first, national interest first. And so he exposed really how he saw the world and how he saw the role of the United States in the world. He said that America can continue being engaged in the world by putting its own national interests above all else. The top priority, he said, of Donald Trump will be the United States. And he had a few lines that were very interesting, which is that from now on, when they decide where U.S. taxpayer dollars go, what they decide to do diplomatically, militarily, will have to answer positively one of the three questions. Does this move make the United States safer? Does it make the United States stronger? Or does it make the United States more prosperous? And this is how they're going to conduct U.S. foreign policy going forward, that the United States is only going to be able to hold on to its role on the world stage if it remains strong at home. He also really laid out one thing that he's known for, which is his strong and very vocal opposition to China. He is known as one of the top China hawks on the Hill, and he has actually been sanctioned by the Chinese for his support of the protests in Hong Kong. So he will likely become the first U.S. Secretary of State to actively be under Chinese sanctions as he takes on that role. But you could clearly see that his foreign policy chops are there. One thing that was interesting, if you compare this to the hearing that we had yesterday for Pete Hegseth for Secretary of Defense, is that this is likely going to be a walk in the park for Marco Rubio, not only because he's experienced and he can answer the questions, but also the type of questions. We're going to see very likely that this hearing is going to be focused not on his character, the way the hearing yesterday was focused on Pete Hegseth's character, but on him defending Donald Trump's policies. The questions, I suspect, from the Democrats will not be criticizing him, but will be asking him, what does this mean for our policy towards Ukraine? What does this mean for our policy towards the Middle East? And we saw Jean Shaheen, who is the ranking member, the Democrat top on this committee, said that she was looking forward to getting answers about Donald Trump's policy when it comes to how they're going to deal with Ukraine, how they're going to deal with the Middle East, and more broadly, how they're going to deal with China. So that was really interesting. One thing he had in common with Pete Hegseth yesterday is the fact that there were, again, several protesters while he was giving his opening statements. Didn't really hear exactly what they were saying, but they were quickly escorted out.
Ketavan Gorjestani, thank you very much indeed for your quick analysis there on Marco Rubio's confirmation hearing, which is ongoing as we speak.